Long before Sun Tzu's art of war was taught in military academies, long before Clausewitz theorized about the fog of war, three nations on the North American continent were already practicing some of the most refined forms of asymmetric warfare the world had ever seen. The Lakota Sioux of the Great Plains, the Comanche of the Southern Plains, and the Apache of the Southwestern Mountains, each built military systems so effective that they not only resisted the expansion of the United States Army for decades, they repeatedly defeated it. This is not a story of savage resistance, this is a story of military genius. If you had to name the single most militarily dominant Native American nation in terms of raw territorial power, the Comanche would be the uncontested answer. At their peak in the 18th and early 19th centuries, Comancheria, the Comanche Empire, stretched across roughly 240,000 square miles, covering much of present-day Texas, New Mexico, Colorado, Kansas, and Oklahoma. They didn't just inhabit this land, they controlled it, taxed it, and defended it with terrifying precision. The Comanche military revolution began with the horse. Acquiring horses from Spanish settlements around 1700, the Comanche adapted to mounted warfare faster and more completely than any other people on the continent. Within a generation, they became perhaps the finest light cavalry force in the world. Comanche warriors could ride at full gallop while hanging off the side of their horse, shielded entirely by the animal's body, and fire arrows accurately underneath the horse's neck. They could shoot 10 arrows per minute, while a trained US soldier with a single-shot rifle could fire 3 rounds in the same time window. In close, fast combat, the Comanche archer was simply superior. But their genius was not just individual skill, it was system. Comanche raiding parties operated with a level of logistical planning that stunned their enemies. Raids were organized months in advance. Routes were memorized across hundreds of miles. Scouts, young warriors assigned specifically to reconnaissance, traveled days ahead of the main party to assess targets, troop strength, and escape routes. After a raid, the group would split into multiple smaller units moving in different directions, converging at a prearranged location far from the target. This made pursuit almost impossible. Their campaign against Spanish and later Mexican Texas, known as the Gran Rastreo or the Great Raid of 1840, illustrated the scale of Comanche strategic thinking. A force of several hundred warriors rode all the way to the Gulf of Mexico, sacking the city of Linville, burning it to the ground, and retreating with enormous quantities of captured goods. The raid penetrated deeper into Texas than any foreign force had before. It was not a desperate attack. It was a calculated demonstration of power. The Comanche also understood something modern strategists call deterrence. Their reputation was their shield. Word of what happened to enemies who resisted Comanche raids traveled faster than any army. Entire settlements were abandoned not because the Comanche were present, but because of the credible fear they might arrive. Where the Comanche built an empire of mobility and terror, the Lakota Sioux built something subtler and in many ways more impressive, a collective military intelligence network capable of coordinating thousands of warriors across vast distances without telegraph, without written orders, without a standing army. The Lakota Sioux military tradition drew from a sophisticated social structure. The Akechita, warrior societies, were not simply clubs for fighters. They were disciplined military organizations with specific roles in battle, policing functions within camp, and the authority to enforce collective decisions. The shirt-wearers, the most elite warriors among the Lakota, served as both military leaders and diplomatic representatives. The system created accountability and professional standards in a society without formal military ranks. Their use of scouts, Anpao Oyate, the Dawn people, was among the most sophisticated on the continent. Lakota scouts didn't merely report enemy positions, they maintained a continuous information network, using smoke signals, mirror flashes, and prearranged horse movements to relay intelligence across miles in minutes. In the days before the Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876, Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse had a near-complete picture of the 7th Cavalry's movements, strength, and intentions. Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer had almost none of theirs. The Battle of the Little Bighorn itself, Greasy Grass in Lakota, is the single most instructive case study in Native American military sophistication. Custer's plan relied on 3 columns converging to trap the Lakota village. The Lakota leadership recognized the strategy and disrupted it by attacking before the columns could coordinate. Crazy Horse executed a flanking maneuver that cut off Custer's retreat. The village's defensive geography, a river on one side, high ground controlling approach routes, was not accidental. The camp had been positioned with military logic. Custer and all 268 men of his immediate command were killed. What makes the Lakota military tradition unique, however, is its adaptation of strategy to politics. Sitting Bull was as much a strategist as a warrior. He understood that the Lakota could not win a prolonged conventional war against the United States, and he designed a campaign meant to raise the political cost of conquest, not achieve outright military victory. His decision to bring together the largest gathering of Plains Indians in history, an estimated 10,000 to 15,000 people at the Little Bighorn camp, was a political statement as much as a military one. The objective was to demonstrate that the Lakota could not be subjugated cheaply. It worked, at least temporarily. The defeat of Custer shocked the American public and became one of the defining political controversies of the era. If the Comanche were the cavalry and the Lakota were the intelligence corps, the Apache were the special forces. No other Native American nation sustained armed resistance for as long, against as many different enemies, with as few resources. The Apache fought the Spanish for 200 years, the Mexicans for another generation, and the United States Army from the 1860s until 1886, and they were never defeated in open battle. The Apache homeland, the Sonoran Desert, the Chihuahuan Desert, and the mountain ranges of present-day Arizona, New Mexico, and northern Mexico was their greatest tactical asset, and they used it with extraordinary intelligence. Apache warriors could travel 70 miles in a single day on foot, through terrain where horses could barely walk. They drank water from cactus pulp, ate insects and roots when necessary, and left almost no trail. General George Crook, who fought them longer and more effectively than any other U.S. commander, wrote that the Apache were the tigers of the human species, and that fighting them was the most difficult military challenge of his career. Apache strategy was built around the ambush as an art form. They chose battle sites with the precision of architects. A classic Apache ambush used terrain to create a kill zone where the enemy had no cover and no retreat. Lookouts positioned miles in advance would signal the approach of a column. The main ambush party would be already in position, sometimes for hours, invisible in rock and brush. When the signal came, the attack was brief, devastating, and over before the enemy could organize a response. The Apache rarely stayed to fight a prolonged engagement. They struck and vanished back into terrain that their pursuers could not navigate. Their decentralized command structure was both a strength and, from the outside, a puzzle. There was no single Apache chief who could surrender the nation and end resistance. Cochise, Mangas, Coloradas, Victorio, and Geronimo each led independent bands. When one group was pressured, others continued. When the army thought it had destroyed Apache resistance by capturing or killing one leader, 3 more were already operating. This multi-headed organizational structure was not a weakness. It was a deliberate adaptation to the reality of fighting a larger, better supplied opponent. It was, in modern terminology, a decentralized insurgency. Geronimo's final campaign between 1885 and 1886 stands as perhaps the most extraordinary display of military endurance in American history. With a band that never exceeded 38 warriors, women, and children, he evaded and frustrated a U.S. Army force of 5,000 soldiers, roughly 1/4 of the entire United States Army at the time, plus 500 Apache scouts and 3,000 Mexican troops for over a year. He was never caught in battle. He ultimately surrendered, on his own terms in negotiation, not because he was defeated, but because there was nowhere left to go. Each of these nations developed military sophistication that was specific to their environment and their strategic reality. A direct comparison requires recognizing what each was optimized for. The Comanche built the most powerful offensive military machine. Their cavalry tactics, logistical network, and deterrence strategy allowed them to project power across an enormous territory and genuinely threaten the survival of competing settlements and nations. For raw military dominance over a defined geographic space, no Native American nation surpassed them. The Lakota Sioux built the most sophisticated collective military intelligence system. Their ability to coordinate large numbers of warriors, gather and disseminate battlefield intelligence, and align military action with political strategy represented a level of organizational complexity that their opponents consistently underestimated, until it was too late. The Little Bighorn campaign was not a lucky ambush. It was the product of weeks of deliberate planning and intelligence work. the Apache built the most durable and adaptable resistance system. Against impossible odds, in terms of numbers, supplies, and territory, they sustained effective armed resistance longer than any other Native American nation against multiple great powers across multiple generations. If the measure of military sophistication is effectiveness relative to available resources, the Apache record is unmatched. There is no single answer, because each system solved a different military problem. But if forced to identify which nation built the most strategically sophisticated military framework, the one that most closely resembles the doctrines that modern armies teach today, the argument points toward the Apache. The Comanche required horses, numbers, and open terrain. Strip any of those away and their system weakened. The Lakota required collective social structures and the ability to assemble large groups, vulnerabilities that the U.S. Army eventually learned to exploit by targeting food supplies and winter camps. The Apache required almost nothing except knowledge, endurance, and terrain. They invented decentralized insurgent warfare centuries before it became a concept in military theory. What Mao Zedong later wrote about guerrilla warfare, move when the enemy advances, attack when he rests, disappear when he pursues, the Apache were already practicing in the Sierra Madre Mountains in the 1700s. They were not fighting a war they expected to win conventionally. They were fighting to make conquest unbearably expensive, and for a very long time, they succeeded. 3 nations, 3 military philosophies. 1 lesson: sophistication is not measured by the size of your army, but by how creatively you use what you have.